And then if we think about the other side, metacognitive regulation, which I said was how we regulate our own thinking, again, let's use examples to try to illustrate this more clearly. So a student that has demonstrated high levels of metacognitive regulation would be one that could select the appropriate strategies to study for an exam, and then modify their approach to future studying based on the outcome of that exam. In contrast, many of us in office hours who have talked to students who might do poorly on an exam and then decide to do more of the same. And this can be a problem because sometimes doubling the time is really not the issue, but rather thinking about what a student does with their study time may be more pressing or important. So we're going to see in a moment that metacognitive regulation involves three important skills called planning, monitoring, and evaluating. But before we dive into that, I just want to remind us of why metacognition is important. Why has my lab decided to focus on it for so long? Well, we know from research that metacognition can predict learning outcomes. We've also seen that it positively correlates with academic achievement in the form of GPA, for example. And we also know that it positively correlates with problem-solving ability, and this has particularly been shown in chemistry and in physics. And then for those of us who have worked very hard over the years to incorporate active learning into our courses, one thing we might consider is that these approaches may not be as successful as we want them to be without a metacognitive component, because there is the risk of students kind of running through the motions of an activity. If they don't think about it in a way that has an effect on their learning by being metacognitive, it may not be successful as we want it to be. So we've said metacognition is broken into metacognitive knowledge and metacognitive regulation. And my lab primarily focuses on metacognitive regulation. And we think about the three important steps down here: planning for a task, monitoring how well the plan is working in real time, and then evaluating after the task to see how well the plan or strategy served this purpose. And I think of these as part of a self-regulated learning cycle, as some of you noted during the early poll that we had a moment ago. So I'm going to use a self-regulated learning cycle to place these metacognitive regulation skills. And I'm going to use the learning task of an exam, not because I think it's the best learning task, but it's a universal learning task we're all familiar with. So if I'm a student in your course and you're giving an online open resource exam because we are in the middle of a global pandemic, one of the first things I might do is assess the task and think about, well, what will be the format of this online open resource exam? I might then consider the strengths and weaknesses I bring to the task. So if I'm a detail-oriented student, I may need to be very mindful of ways to connect ideas. Then I can create a plan for learning, which would involve specific study strategies and a timeline for when I might enact them. And then I can apply these approaches and ask myself in real time, by monitoring their performance, how well are these approaches serving me? So if one of my approaches was going to be to replay each of the Zoom lectures at 1.5x speed, I can ask myself as I'm viewing those Zoom lectures again, how well is this working for me? And then evaluation is something that's done after a task is completed and feedback is given, perhaps in the form of a grade or other assessment feedback. And in this part of the cycle, one can reflect on how well the strategies and the time spent serve the overall goals that, in this case, I had for learning for an online open resource exam. So I want to point out that each of the steps in this cycle can be affected by students' beliefs about learning. So if I feel strongly that my instructor determines the grade, I may not be as motivated to spend time on some of or all of these steps. And just to remind you, my research groups focuses on these three steps of planning, monitoring, and evaluating, which will come up again in today's talk. So I always love to share a little bit about metacognitive development because I think it's so fascinating. one of the things we know is that between the ages of 8 to 10 is when we actually see metacognition being used successfully for academic purposes. And so this is where interventions have been shown to be effective. And then between the ages of 14 and 18, the high school years, there tends to be a linear growth in metacognition, with students learning metacognitive skills first in a domain-specific fashion. Meaning, if I learn how to be metacognitive in a chemistry course, I will most likely be able to transfer those skills to a biochemistry course than I would be to, say, a history course. We also know that college likely provides a number of opportunities for students to grow in their metacognitive development because students tend to use metacognition when they find something both challenging and important. And often their studies in college can rise to that level, especially, for example, if it's in their major. But while so much great work has been done at the K through 12 level, we don't understand as much about the development of metacognition in college or in young adults. But we do know that development continues well into adulthood. So there have been studies done by researchers in Europe looking at individuals who are ages 40, 60, and so on. So we know that there's room for development. So the point I want to underscore for us as we move into some of the data is that the undergraduates that many of us work with are still developing their metacognition. So we have this opportunity to help them. And I want us to think about how could we more effectively target their development of these skills. So this brings us to the first story I want to share. This was a study that I did in collaboration with Xanthi Nieder, Saro Gallegos, and Nicole Kelp. And the background for this study is that I was teaching introductory biology for majors at another institution. And this class was quite large, about 400 students per semester. And at the time I started teaching the class, the C- DFW rate, or the rate of students not passing the course, was 30 to 35%. And in fact, it was pushing towards 40%. And so this was problematic on many levels. But one of the major concerns that we had was the fact that we were losing very talented students to other majors because they were not able to pass introductory biology on the first try. So I dug into the literature and utilized some of the approaches that many of you are likely already familiar with. I included opportunities for collaboration and opportunities for structure and practice. But I wanted to do more. And so I had learned about metacognition as a graduate student. And I wondered, could metacognition enhance learning in an undergraduate biology course? But here's where I have to be really honest with you as an audience. As Sammy said, I was trained as a cell biologist. And I enthusiastically jumped into some research where I tried to create interventions for my introductory biology students where they would have a chance to hopefully practice metacognition. And the results of that study were statistically significant, but very underwhelming. And they just led me to take a step back and ask, why isn't it working as well as I predicted? And what I realized is that we don't, as I mentioned earlier, know as much about development of metacognitive skills in college as we do in the K through 12 setting. And so more work needed to be done to effectively target metacognitive development in undergraduate skills. So I had to ask a new research question. And as a first step toward my goal, I asked, which metacognitive regulation skills are evident in introductory biology students? So what do they already show they're able to do? And my approach was to study metacognition in the context of exam preparation. As I said earlier, this is a universal learning task, but also it's one that rises to meet the criteria I shared earlier, which would be that students tend to use metacognition when they find something both challenging and important. And so I use exam self-evaluation assignments. And this course had 3 exams and a cumulative final. So 2 self-evaluation assignments were given after exams 1 and 2. So what did these metacognitive assignments look like? Well, they included both short answer and open-ended questions, and they were really focused on those 3 metacognitive regulation skills I mentioned earlier: planning, monitoring, and evaluating. So for example, students were asked, which study strategies work well for exam 1 that you would plan to use again for exam 2, and why? And then the second exam evaluation was different. This also consisted of short answer and open-ended questions, but the focus this time was in part on whether or not they followed their plan that they made for exam 2. And this was really important to us because metacognitive regulation involves the actions we take to learn. So not just the thinking, but also the actions. And so we asked students some simple questions like, did you follow the plan you outlined for exam 2? And why were you or weren't you able to follow your plan? So I want to share with you the approach we took to analyzing our qualitative data, which is a very well-established approach called content analysis. So first we read all of the exam 1 self-evaluations with metacognition in mind. We had 245 students, a double page assignment, so roughly 500 pages of data. We then went back to the data again, and this time we looked more intently for evidence that students were able to plan, monitor, and evaluate their learning. And we labeled the relevant segments of the data using codes. And then we developed a coding rubric or code book, and we coded the assignments in 20% increments. We would do this on our own and then come together as a team to discuss the coding. We would revise the code book as needed and repeat this process until we had stabilized our codes and coded all of our assignments, and we then summarized the data. We repeated this process for exam 2, which was also a 2-page assignment. So all in all, we're talking about 1,000 pages of data. And from these analyses, we were able to propose a model of metacognitive regulation. So I want to share with you some of the key results. One of the questions we asked was, can students evaluate the effectiveness of their learning strategies? And about 50% of the students provided evidence in their self-evaluation assignments that they could do this. I want to show you what this looked like. So a student who was able to evaluate effectiveness said, I don't feel that my flashcard method worked because I focused on terms instead of concepts. In contrast, a student that did not provide evidence for the ability to evaluate said, it's not necessarily study strategies didn't work for me, it's that I didn't try enough. I need to try more. And this statement that we see here at the bottom could be very true for that student, but it doesn't show us that they have the ability to evaluate the effectiveness of a particular learning strategy. We also ask, can students reflect on their study plans and adjust it based on performance? And about 45% of the students showed evidence of this. Here's an example of what it looked like. A student said, reviewing the notes after each class will allow me to focus on areas where I'm struggling and ask questions sooner. So here is a student that was able to reflect and adjust based on their performance. They had identified that they were getting behind on the material, and so they were able to respond with a new approach. On this assignment, we shared with students some of the approaches used by students who were successful in the course. And the student whose quote at the bottom is shown here had chosen 5 of those strategies. And when asked why, they wrote, anything can help if you've not received 100%. So while we were excited that they were willing to do something new, this quote shows that they're not necessarily understanding how the things they selected will meet some of the challenges they experienced. So after exam 2, we also looked to see how much time students spent or reported spending, because as you can imagine, many of them said that was a major issue. And about 75% reported that they spent more time studying for exam 2. Interestingly, we had seen these beautiful plans that students made on their self-evaluation after exam 1, and we wanted to know, as I said, did they follow it? And about half of the students reported that they followed their plan. And those that didn't gave a number of reasons that I bet you could predict. So they had other coursework, they had an illness or an emergency that came up. And all of those things are important, but they're out of our influence as instructors. So what was really interesting to us is those students who did not follow their plan for reasons like the ones shown here. Some students felt they didn't need to. So when they considered how well they knew the material, they felt that they knew it better than they actually did. So they didn't follow their plan. And then some students said they didn't know how to. So it was really interesting to me. A student had said they were going to use concept maps, but the student later reported on the next evaluation that not only have they never made a concept map themselves, they had never seen one. And so this was really interesting to us as to things we could maybe target in the future. So as I said, from these data and other data that I'm not showing due to time, we were able to propose a metacognitive continuum of where students might be in introductory biology based on our sample population. Very rarely, we found a category we call not engaging. Only less than 5% of the students fell into this category. These students didn't see any need to change their plan, and so they didn't select any new strategies or report carrying them out. And they would say things like, my strategies worked, but the exam was written in a complicated manner. So to this student, any issue seems to be outside of them and not something they ought to be engaging in. Most of the students in our introductory biology study fit into the two categories you see here, the struggling and emerging. Struggling students would see a need to change, but they didn't select appropriate strategies for the issues they reported having. So for example, one student said on multiple choice exams, he could narrow it down to 2 choices out of 5, but he had a lot of trouble deciding between those last 2 choices. And his approach was going to be to read the chapter summaries at the end of the chapter. And if we take a moment to think about this approach, you can imagine that perhaps the chapter summary is not going to provide him the more nuanced or detailed knowledge needed to select one of those 2 that he'd narrowed it down to on a multiple choice exam. The emerging students saw a need to change. They were able to select appropriate strategies, but as I mentioned earlier, sometimes they didn't carry them out for a number of reasons. And then lastly, we identified a category of students that was rare in our population of introductory biology students, which was the developing category. These students saw a need to change. They could select appropriate strategies and they carried them out. And a lot of what they talked about was ways that new approaches could enhance their learning or the efficiency of their learning. So they talked about things in a very different way. So this model of proposed stages, the not engaging, struggling, emerging, and developing, is one of the first models of metacognitive development proposed for undergraduates. And there are 2 important things I should mention. First of all, the stages may not be sequential, meaning it may be possible to go from a not engaging stage to an emerging stage without passing through a struggling stage. And also, the stage that a student finds himself in may vary based on the context. So what I mean by that is a student may be developing in a physics course, which is in their major, but may be struggling or not engaging in a public speaking course outside their major. So now I want to invite you to think about where students you're currently teaching or you may teach in the future might be on the proposed continuum. And I'm going to invite you to think about this for about 2 minutes on your own. And then I'll offer a Zoom poll where we can share anonymously where we think students that we're currently teaching or will teach in the near future might be. And I never like my students or my audience to be bored. So If you identify the stage you think your students might be at, then you could move on to the bonus question, which is, how do you think this might affect your learning? So I will turn off my camera to allow you to focus inward for just about 2 minutes. And then we'll come back together and share our responses in a Zoom poll. Thank you so much for taking a moment to consider this question. And now I want to invite you to share your response with the group. So you can go ahead and fill out the Zoom poll here. And it's possible, if you're like me, that there are students in your class that fit in more than one category. So you can go ahead and share that. Okay, great. Thank you so much. So let me share the results. For our group today, it looks like the majority of us have students that fit in the struggling category, about 87%, as well as the emerging category, about 65%. And the not engaging and developing categories, a little bit more less seen in our different classrooms. And so thank you so much for sharing that. This fits with a lot of the data we've collected in different courses. What I want to ask is if anyone had a moment to think about how this might affect your students' learning. And if you feel comfortable, I would love it if you would, turn on your microphone and your video if you're able and share your answer to this question. How might the proposed stage in the continuum that you mentioned here, how might this affect their learning? And again, we're just here to share ideas. So
I'll offer.
Go ahead. Thank you.
I think it makes a huge chunk of my students frustrated with the whole experience of college. I think they think they're trying, and they think they're working, and they are. They're putting time in, but they're frustrated. They want to see success come out of that work. So it puts a lot of responsibility on us to help them get through it.
Thank you, Joe. And which of the categories do you find most of the students that you were mentioning in?
Well, the struggling group for sure, right? That group, they're reading the book, they're copying the notes, they're watching the lectures again. But all of the things that they tend to tell you in office hours are very passive activities. I listen to the TA recite, show problems. I watch my friends help me do problems. Nothing is on their, they think they're working, but they're not.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate that because you're right. When our students feel like they're putting in all of this time and effort, even though their efforts and time might not be directed at what is most beneficial for them, there is a frustration of feeling like they're trying and it's not beneficial or not fruitful yet. And so part of what we realized from this particular study is that for introductory biology students and some other groups of students, we needed to spend time within the class itself to share with them different approaches for learning. And I should be clear to say that there isn't a special day for study strategies, but rather when we're covering material that lends itself to a particular type of approach, we could then embed that within the instruction. And we found that that started to help students build up their repertoire of other different ways of studying. Because as you said, they can kind of lean back on passive approaches, especially if those passive approaches led to them earning the grades that they wanted to earn in high school. And so part of what my research group is doing now is thinking about how do we intentionally build in opportunities for students to learn metacognitive knowledge, which is really what you and I are talking about, that understanding of what you ought to be doing and how do you actually do it. Thank you again. So this work led to new research questions. And one of the things we really wanted to know was why did emerging students fail to follow their study plans? And when, why, and how did developing students acquire skills like evaluation? And so in order to answer these questions, we needed to turn to a different student population because, as I said, the developing students were quite rare in our sample of introductory biology students. So we turned to senior biology students, reasoning that perhaps they might have more well-developed metacognitive skills. And we decided to focus on one skill, the skill of evaluation. And remember, evaluation is a metacognitive regulation skill that involves considering how effective were individual learning strategies, and then how effective was the overall study plan. So appraising and adjusting overall study plans. So we had 3 research questions that we entered into this work with. First, when do senior biology students evaluate their approaches to learning? And then what causes them to evaluate and how do they evaluate? What's the basis of their appraisal? And what I love about qualitative work is that you can answer questions that you did not know to ask. And so we wound up gaining data that helped us address a question that we had, but hadn't yet put down formally. And that is, what barriers do students face when they try to change their approaches to learning? So this course that we collected data in is a senior level course that has 3 exams and a cumulative final. And we used an approach called purposeful sampling, where we analyzed data from student self-evaluation assignments after exams 1 and 2, and then identified students who showed evidence of high metacognitive regulation skills and invited them for interviews. And I want to share with you how we did those interviews now. So we used a semi-structured interview protocol, which, as many of you know, allows the freedom for a researcher to ask a follow-up question if it's relevant to the work. So we had 27 open-ended questions and a card sorting activity. And this activity involved the graduate student, Katie Dye, who I collaborated with on this project. Katie wrote down each of the strategies a student reported using themselves for exams 1 and 2. And then she asked students to sort those cards from the most to least effective, and then walk her through their rationale for each of these decisions. And so card sorting activity is a method from anthropology which invites a participant to talk more deeply about something. In this case, their evaluation of individual learning strategies. And we use content analysis and coding for patterns, as I mentioned earlier in the talk. So one of our questions was, when do students evaluate? And you probably won't be surprised when I tell you they generally are not evaluating in high school. And this is because our participants said they were able to earn A grades without really studying. And so there wasn't a lot of need to think about how they were approaching learning. Also, it was very interesting to see that some students were very perceptive and from hindsight realized that the teachers were actually scaffolding their learning, meaning giving them homework that really set them up and directed their learning to reach the goals of the course. So Hannah, which is a pseudonym, Hannah said, in high school especially, you always had homework to be doing. So they kept you up on your studies. In college, you were really left to your own, which is really different. So if we were in the room together, I might invite you to predict, if students are telling us they're not evaluating in high school, what class might they be evaluating in? And since we're in a Zoom setting, if you want to share an answer in the chat, you could open up the chat and share, where do you think students in our study might have said, if high school isn't causing them to reflect on how they're learning, what was the class in college that caused them to do this? So great. Yes. So intro bio, intro chem, English. Yes. Thank you so much for these ideas. And we definitely saw students, physics, yes, that had mentioned each of the classes listed in the chat. But the majority of students talked about organic chemistry. So many of us know organic chemistry having a certain reputation, but I want to share with you, as a metacognitive researcher, I think organic chemistry is potentially a wonderful time for students to develop metacognitive skills. And what students in our study shared about organic chemistry is that this presented them with new challenges. So they had to learn by non-math-based problem solving, and that caused them to rethink how they approached learning, how they studied for the course. Also, students talked about the fact that they expected organic chemistry to be very difficult. And so when the class was challenging, they didn't try to blame the instructor or the textbook or the TA. They really just accepted the fact that organic chemistry is not only different, but it's also just going to be hard. Haley said, it almost felt like a different language with organic chemistry. Just memorizing facts didn't do any good. It was all about practice, and I had to study a little differently. So this was really interesting to us about organic chemistry. We also asked what causes students to evaluate. And most of the students in our study really leaned on external indicators. Specifically, they were evaluating if they earned a grade that they considered to be unsatisfactory on an exam. Brandon said, I know I won't change unless I'm not doing well. Some of the students in our study use internal indicators, meaning they were able to judge for themselves. And usually those students were doing this as they checked their understanding while studying. And Wendy said, I realized as I was studying that I needed to change my study methods because looking at the old tests that was provided, I realized I didn't have enough in my head to answer it. So students were largely evaluating in response to an external indicator such as a grade. Some were relying on studying using tools that were very close to the exam itself. We also found that students evaluated in response to certain course characteristics. And I'm going to talk about a senior level cell biology course because that's where data collection took place. But you will find that the characteristics I list here could apply to many other science courses. So cell biology posed a new challenge because students were asked to analyze data, to design experiments and predict outcomes. The exams were 100% short essay or long answer, whereas they were used to a lot of multiple choice exams. The course also emphasized higher order thinking rather than just memorization. And the discipline of cell biology is inherently detailed. So while the professors tried to take a conceptual approach, there were names and mechanisms that required details at a level they had maybe not seen before. So now I want to share some unexpected results, which I hinted at earlier. And what we found is that some participants avoided effective learning strategies, and some participants did not change how they studied despite very accurate evaluations of their own preparation and performance. So they knew what they ought to be doing, but they just didn't do it. And so we wanted to learn about the barriers students face when they try to change their approaches for learning. So what you see on the left-hand side is a visual representation of a card sort activity from a student whose pseudonym is Abby. And Abby has arranged her cards from what she finds most effective to least effective. And at this point in the interview, she was explaining to Katie a few things about these two approaches. She said, a lot of times study groups and practice exams just make me a lot more anxious and more stressed than I need to be. Someone will say something that doesn't line up with what I thought, and sometimes the discussion just makes me doubt my own knowledge of the material. And so here Abby was feeling anxious and stressed when she was confronted with things that maybe she was not as certain of. And in this interview, she failed to recognize the value of identifying areas of confusion prior to the exam because of the feeling that it brought her to be confronted with that information. Here's another example. This one is from Bridget. Again, Bridget has arranged her own cards from least to most effective. And this is a part of the transcript where she's talking about condensing and revising her notes, which she said is a process of copying and recopying the notes. There's not a lot of changes actually being made despite the way that she described it here. So Bridget said, this is like my comfort food of studying. Condensing and revising notes? Yeah, because it's super passive. Okay, take me through it. Well, it's just stuff that I kind of cling to when I'm feeling really uncomfortable with the material. So Bridget went on to explain she could articulate exactly what she should be doing to be more effective in her learning and how to actually do that. But she explained that when she gets uncomfortable, she leans back on those strategies that brought her success in the past in high school, and copying and recopying her notes was one of those approaches. So just to summarize, I want to point out first that most of the students in our study embrace difficulty in learning, but as I just shared, some of the students avoided discomfort. Sometimes it was because they didn't see the benefit of it. They lacked awareness of that, like Abby, who didn't want to know that she was confused about a topic. Or they avoided discomfort despite awareness of its benefits. So we saw Bridget knew better ways, more active ways to study, but she chose passive ways because of the comfort it brought her. So this points to us that students may need help understanding the value of difficulty in learning. This is not something that some of our students have been brought up appreciating, and they also might need help anticipating and planning for barriers. It was fascinating. We had one student who knew that he loved to read and reread the textbook, and he knew that wasn't a good approach. So he actually shared the textbook with someone else because it was so expensive. And so he would have the textbook first early on in a course section, and then he would make sure the person he shared the book with had it later on, so that when studying for the test, he wouldn't just reread passages. So he anticipated this and planned for it. A few things I want to share for our teaching is that undergraduates may need help learning how to evaluate because they're coming to us from high school, potentially without much experience with evaluation because they're doing so well in high school that they may not need to. And I say the next piece with a bit of caution. That is, we found students in our study tended to evaluate after they earned what they considered to be an unsatisfactory grade on an exam. So students may benefit from a challenging first exam. And I don't want you to go and blow them out of the water in January 2021 with the most difficult exam you can come up with. But I know that many of us have had the approach of maybe starting with an easier exam. And I would just share with you that when we've collected data in courses that did that, students didn't engage in metacognition because they were doing so well. And then when the course ramped up later on, they were scrambling to start to use those skills. And then lastly, we as instructors may want to talk more about the benefits of discomfort while learning and normalize this experience for students, because some of them are really actively avoiding it, not realizing that when you are learning something challenging, it is likely to be tough and maybe feel uncomfortable at first. And then lastly, I'll just mention that we found upper division students can evaluate in response to post-exam assignments. And if you're interested, you can ask me at the end. I'll share some links where you can get some free post-exam assignments if you don't have one that you like to use already. So the last story for today is one in which we tried to compare introductory and senior biology students. And we asked two questions. How do these two groups of students compare in their use of evaluation? And what's their reasoning? What's the rationale behind the evaluations they make? And really our goal here was to try to learn something about how students develop metacognition so we might allow them to use it earlier in their college career. So this is a cross-sectional study, and ideally we would do a longitudinal study, which we recently received funding for and will launch in fall 2021. But at the time we used these two time points to try to learn something about metacognitive development. So just a reminder that evaluation skills include being able to determine if a strategy is effective or ineffective, and being able to evaluate an overall study plan. Here's an example. A student might say, these are my 3 strategies. I'm going to type the class notes after each lecture. I'm going to write answers to practice questions on the weekends, and I'm going to meet with a study group the day before the exam. So a student could ask themselves whether or not each of these individually worked, and how did the overall plan serve their goals for learning. And this is really important, because if our students cannot evaluate, they're not going to study efficiently. Essentially, they're going to waste time doing things that are not beneficial, similar to what Joe and I talked about earlier in today's seminar. And then they're going to get frustrated on top of that, as he correctly pointed out. So we again use exam self-evaluation assignments and content analysis. We used a slightly different form of coding called magnitude coding, where you look for the level of evidence provided by the student's data. So this is our last Zoom poll for today. I want to invite you to make a prediction. How do you think introductory and senior students compared in their use of evaluation skills? So let's go to this. All right. So here I'm posing to you whether, I'll just read it. I predict that seniors will be better than introductory biology students at identifying what works, identifying what doesn't work, evaluating their overall study plans, 2 or more of the above, or none of the above. I'm just going to give 10 seconds for folks who want to still weigh in here. Yeah, so thank you so much for sharing your idea. The majority of our group selected 2 or more of the above, and that's exactly what we as researchers predicted. We thought that seniors would show more evidence of 2 or more of the skills listed here, but we found something a little different, so let's take a look. So the data I'm showing you on the left refers to the data from 174 senior biology students and 141 introductory biology students. And if they provided sufficient evidence of being able to evaluate, that is shown in black, moderate evidence is shown in dark gray, and insufficient evidence is shown in light gray. And what we found using chi-square tests of independence is that there was no statistically significant difference in the evidence provided by senior and introductory biology students for being able to evaluate what works. And when we look at the same setup in terms of their evidence for evaluating what doesn't work or ineffective strategies, we again see that the p-value indicates no statistically significant difference. So in our study, introductory and senior students do not differ in their ability to evaluate strategies. And so this was surprising to us. So we wanted to look at what is the reasoning, what's the rationale behind these evaluations. So one of the things we learned from our thematic analysis is that we found that senior students tend to evaluate their strategies based on mechanisms of learning, which would allow them to determine if something was effective. In contrast, we found that introductory students really were focused more on evaluating strategies as effective if a resource they were using for studying was very similar or aligned with the exam. So let me give you an example of a quote from a senior student. They said, "My strategy allowed me to repeat information multiple times. And because of long-term potentiation, I was able to remember this information." So this knowledge was not covered in the class where data collection took place. We don't know where this senior student learned about long-term potentiation, but we did find this trend and theme where seniors would talk more about mechanisms of learning as a way of explaining why a strategy was effective. When we look at why students report that a strategy is ineffective, we found that senior students will evaluate the way they used a strategy and say it was ineffective. So how they enacted a particular approach, they would critique. In contrast, introductory students would evaluate a strategy irrespective of how they used it. So they wouldn't critique how they enacted the strategy, they would just critique the strategy itself. So to give an example, an introductory biology student said, "Studying the old test did not work well. You don't get answers for the old test, so they are basically useless." In contrast, we had senior students who said that their use of old tests was ineffective because they didn't use them the way that they ought to have been used. And they would go on and outline and say, "I should have used a timer to time myself answering the questions without any resources to really test myself," for example. And then when we looked at evaluating the overall study plan, we found that seniors demonstrate more ability to evaluate their overall plans than introductory biology students. So here we saw a difference. So for those of you who selected that choice, you were right on. But even though seniors do better at this than introductory biology students, what we can tell by looking at the other two skills is that evaluating overall plans is harder for both groups. And this is probably because evaluating the overall plan is a synthesis skill that may require more for development. So what was their reasoning? Students evaluated their overall study plans, and both groups use their feelings as a way to evaluate or their performance as a way to evaluate their study plans. And seniors also considered how well their plans helped them learn. So one senior student said, "My plan worked well enough. I studied in a way that gave me a brief pass over the major points, but I should have better understood individual concepts and how they relate to each other." So this student was able to identify, for example, that their plan wasn't allowing them to connect ideas and that was something they'd have to pay attention to going forward. So just to summarize, both groups of students in our study demonstrated similar ability to evaluate individual learning strategy, but their reasoning in some cases could vary greatly. And we found that senior level students demonstrated greater ability to evaluate their overall study plans, but we're still seeing both groups of students use performance or their feelings to evaluate their overall study plans instead of focusing in on whether or not those plans help them learn. So my last implications for teaching slide is one in which I share with you that introductory students may need help learning different ways to use a study strategy. For example, one thing we found disheartening is some of the introductory biology students said, "Well, I tried study groups once, it didn't work, I'm not doing that again." When maybe the way they were enacting study groups just needs to be modified. And so we realize they might need some more direct instruction or intentional information about how to effectively run a study group if they've not done that before. We found that students need more help to evaluate their overall plans so they could be encouraged by not just asking how effective was your plan and why, but whether or not their plan allowed them to do specific things. So we could ask students, how well did your plan help you understand concepts? How well did your plan help you apply concepts and make connections between concepts? And reframing the evaluation in this way could be more helpful because so many students will respond based on how they feel or how they performed. So I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to skip the future directions. I just want to say that if instructors can help students develop their metacognition, then students' metacognitive skills will contribute to their success, not only in their current courses, but in other courses as well. And really important to me is that I find metacognition is so important because it can help students become lifelong learners. I'd like to thank my collaborators at University of Georgia, Washington State University, the UGA Biology Education Research Group, and a quick plug that my collaborators and I have a free evidence-based teaching guide on metacognition that will be available in early 2021. We just looked at the proofs, and that's in CB Life Sciences Education. So we translate a lot of research to practical suggestions that you could implement in your courses. And with that, I'll thank you so much for your time, especially close to the end of the semester, and invite any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Stanton. And if anybody has any questions for Dr. Stanton, please unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can type in the chat as well.
I can start.
Yes, sure.
Okay. So could you speak to the relationship between the role of metacognition and the role of cognitive development for the students? What I'm specifically asking toward is I think most of our students come in as concrete learners, and many times we're asking them to be formal learners. And so there's a relationship between how I think about a problem and or my expectation for an exam and how I think about my own learning.
Yeah, so I think, let me make sure first that I have your question correct. You're asking what do we know about the relationship between development of metacognition and development of cognition, and especially with respect to aspects like being a concrete learner versus, and I missed the last part. Could you repeat that?
Well, it's just that you noted that organic chemistry was the big gap, but that's where really in chemistry, we largely turn from a lot of concrete questions to very formal questions. And so it may not have anything to do with metacognition. It may be the expectation of the students for the type of questions that they're going to be asked.
Yeah, so I think that there are two parts in play. What you mentioned, that change from chemistry to organic chemistry is there. And I think what our research is showing is that sometimes shifts in what students are being asked to do cause them to ask themselves, how is it I'm learning? And I think that even if it's really more so the shift of the concrete to the formal, that event, if you will, is still causing them to pause and ask themselves, okay, what I normally do is not successful, is not working here. And whereas in other cases where the shift or the new challenge is not so great, what we've found is students often will say, I'm going to give it another try. I'm going to give it a third try. And so they're repeating the same thing over and over, getting the same, if unsatisfactory result for them and for us, in part because they're not yet recognizing that the shift, no matter what it is requiring, or the class in general is requiring something new. So yeah, it's interesting to think about it from that side. And definitely what we see is just students responding to something that is very different for them, because
Right.
then they don't try to repeat what they've done before. Yeah.
Yeah, what was interesting is you drew the timeline of metacognition development up through 18, and we didn't know after 18. And I think that concrete formalism development is happening in parallel.
Yeah, a lot of people talk about, say, William Perry's developmental scheme for learners. And what's different about that is they're not necessarily looking at the metacognitive regulation skills of planning, monitoring, and evaluating. They are looking at differences in how students, for example, epistemology, or how they think about, knowing something in a discipline. So I agree with you. It would be interesting to start to line these things up, but we don't actually have enough data right now to be able to do it. Because the gold standard really for understanding development has to be a longitudinal study. And so far, no one has done an in-depth longitudinal study on metacognition. So thank you so much for your question, Joe. I appreciate it.
And you have a question in the chat box from Stephen too about this,
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Stephen's question, which I'll just read out loud, is students often look for a study hack or magic bullet for learning. Developing good learning strategies take time and are difficult to develop, as your research shows. How do we get them to slow down and change their expectations? Yeah, this is an excellent question, because I think what we definitely have seen is students who are willing to change. They know strategies they can use. They may have the metacognitive knowledge to enact them and use them in the right time and place. But there is an expectation that this change will happen quickly. And so a lot of what we've had to do in our courses, maybe not so much in our research, but in our courses, is really to say to students, this is going to take time. And so you might not see a change right now, but I want you to stick with it. And I think you'll see a change later. And so there's some different ways we can try to make that process better for them in terms of breaking things down. I know some approaches include things like a small mini exam prior to the first exam that kind of gets students' attention, and then an introduction of strategies that would take place kind of over time. But I find the best way is really just being transparent, really a lot of communication around, how these things work, and then ample opportunities for practice to the extent that we're able to in our courses, whether that's practice that we do together with our students or practice we strongly encourage through other activities required outside of class. So yeah, thank you for that.
I was going to chime in too and just say, because we have a lot of the fellows who are actually been reading Susan Ambrose's book, which you used a little bit in some of the things, called How Students Learn. I posted that link here. The thing, and what I was going to say is, let's see, Stephen, if you read that book, at the end of every chapter, they give concrete strategies on how to implement, and there's a whole chapter devoted to metacognition. And I was going to suggest two things, if that's okay, Julie.
Yeah, of course. Please.
One is something I've been using for a long time, which is called testing your memory. How many of us have a student who'll say, but I thought I knew it, and I went to the exam and I just went blank. And it's because students they're not educated on short-term versus long-term memory. They don't understand how that actually works. Remote memory, using short-term memory, worked for them in high school. And then actually building towards long-term memory, they don't understand that conceptually, because they're like, I just need to teach the test, right? I need to take this test and then be done with it, right? And so what they'll say is, I thought I knew it. And so what's happening is what all of you said. They were reading their textbook, they were listening to the lecture, doing all passive learning. So after the first exam in our classes, the first thing I do is I say, okay, how many of you felt this way? And they'll say, yeah. And I'll say, at any point when you're studying for exam one, because if you talk about this on the first week, they won't listen to you. I'll say, did you test your memory? Did you know what you know? And they would say, yeah, I knew what I knew. I said, but did you know what you didn't know? And that's when they go, oh my God. And so then in the classroom, we often do the blank piece of paper, which is, you know, we just went over some crazy thing for 45 minutes. Let's pull out a blank piece of paper and see what you remember from that. And then we talk about what that's showing them, which is in that moment, they're working with short-term memory. They're going to remember this, but if they did the blank piece of paper in a week or 2 or 2 weeks before the exam, would they still know what they just heard? And they get to a place where they go, oh my gosh, I don't know what I don't know. And that's the point. Testing your memory can be flashcards. There's any mechanism, handing your notes to a friend and saying, test my memory, what I know about this. And that's a really great metacognition strategy for getting them to understand what they don't know. There's something else I was going to say. The self-assessment is really important to for us in the introduction biology to the genetics courses here, because students leave someone like Sammy's class and they think they know what a cell is and how photosynthesis is and all this stuff, and then they get to a higher level class and they just memorize their way through it and they don't remember anything else. So self-assessment's something we use really that's effective as well for that process.
Yeah, thank you, Penny, so much for sharing that. And I think those are great ideas. And ideas like that are included in that evidence-based teaching guide that we just finished with John Dunlosky, who's a cognitive scientist, and Amanda Sebesta, who's a biology education researcher. I just noticed I wanted to mention, I don't know if we have any time left, but Sarah had a great idea. She said she'd love to see a bunch of professors get in front of a class and practice being in a study group together. And what I love about this idea is we've definitely found with students that something where we can actually demonstrate for them how a learning strategy is meant to be done. So we talk a lot about think aloud protocols where we might, not for research purposes, but for the students' learning purposes, demonstrate a particular approach or study strategy and really talk through all of our thoughts out loud. And really fascinating to me is, you know, a lot of our students are gamers and they spend time on YouTube where there's these expert gamers who make millions of dollars are actually doing think alouds where they're saying, okay, now I'm turning left and this is what I'm going to find here. And now I'm going to do this. And so we've also tried to adapt that demonstration so that students it's one thing to know that a strategy exists and what it's for, but when you actually see it carried out, as Sarah suggested, it not only makes it more possible to do yourself, but it makes it, as one researcher pointed out, less possible for a student to say that can't be done. So when a student, for example, sees a demonstration or think aloud as I'm talking about, they can no longer say, concept maps can't be done, because they have seen it and they, more importantly, hopefully have insight in how to carry it out. So I saw that and I appreciate it. Thank you. And then I don't know if there was another question I missed. The chat scrolled by quickly. Penny, did you see another question?
There are some more questions, but more comments. G said, give students successful experiences with new methods, could use class time to guide students using a new method. Yes, and actually I was gonna say, students often have like a bunch of content on a slide and I show them in the classroom how to turn that into a learning tool. So that might be just showing them how to create a grid, a comparison grid. And you'd be shocked, but a lot of students are like, I never thought to take and turn all this word verbiage into a grid, right? And so that's one way to do that in the classroom that I think G's pointing out as an example. Is there a version of the book? Yeah, I already answered that question. And then people are just posting links. I actually don't see any more questions, Julie.
Okay. Yeah, well, it's been
I have a follow-up there. Okay. I was the one who wrote the question about, is there a book for students?
Oh, okay.
And I don't think that I actually got an answer to that. So having a book for me as a teacher is one thing, but I was hoping for a book that I could actually recommend to my students.
A lot of people I know have started to recommend Sandra McGuire's book, and I'm looking on my bookshelf here if I can see.
There's a Sandra McGuire called Teach Students How to Learn, but then it's also students. I'm going to try to find it real quick and I'll post it.
Yeah, so there's the Teach Students How to Learn was the original version, but more toward your point, the second version, which is actually she did it in collaboration with Mark McDaniel, a really well-known cognitive scientist, is from the student side. So I have not had an opportunity to read that book yet, but that could be a book that could be valuable for students to think about metacognition from their side. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, there are two books actually. One is for the instructors and another one is for the students, and it's a great book. I've actually started recommending students read that book when they are in my 100 level intro bio.
And
Yeah,
then
I
I
was gonna-
think,
Go ahead, go ahead, Julie.
oh, no, I was just going to say, I noticed Effie maybe had a question about card sorting. So it's just a question about card sorting activity question mark, but maybe Effie could.
Hi, sorry, yes.
Oh, no, you're great. I'm happy to try to answer.
I think that'd be a good first day activity. So I was wondering where I could get more information. I mean, I know I could probably put something together, but if you've already done it, I would love to get that information.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I love your idea of maybe using that in the classroom. We used it primarily as a research tool. So all we had done was really look at the data students had shared with us and what strategies they said they used. And then we just Katie wrote them on cards and invited them to order the cards most to least effective as just a way to learn more about how they were evaluating. But you could ask your students to, depending on what course it was, think about the strategies they're using or they had used previously in a similar course, and you could have them do that sorting as well. But I think it's described in our 2017 paper, which I could pull the link
I
for.
already pulled it. I'll look
okay.
through it. I just thought if it's in there, that's great. I just didn't want to, I thought I'd just ask real quick.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking. But I like your idea of using it as a classroom tool and not just as like a research tool, because I love.
Yeah, I thought that would be a fun first day, and so that they can actually have some visual hands-on group. I'd probably make them do them in groups as well if we ever get back to the classroom, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I'm happy if you want to send me an email if you have a follow-up question. I know folks have other places they need to be, but thank you again to Sammy and to the Rose Network for the opportunity and the invitation. And I hope that you all have a smooth end of the semester. So
Thank you so much, Julie. We appreciate your time today.
sure, you're welcome. Take care.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.